So yeah, we'll keep it pretty organic. We've got about an hour and 15 minutes before morning tea. You're welcome to sort of ask questions while I'm talking. And yeah, we'll just slowly make our way through it. So I assume this is, let's give this a whirl. So this morning session, I just want to focus a lot on the principles, and then as we get past morning tea and go into lunchtime, we can talk a lot more about the actual methods that we're going to use or you can use and how to do them. The reason why I want to focus on principles is just because, you know, if you can grasp the big picture, then it enables you to go and apply it in your context. So, you know, as much as there's a lot of things that work across the board, there's also a lot of little sort of nuances and you know, also ideas that you might come up with that sort of apply better in your situation. But I think, you know, the general principles are pretty universal. Only problem with this statement, it was obviously come up with a long time ago, and it just says man everywhere. So I don't know if that just means that women have already got it, or whether it was just old school. Yeah. Cool. So we're wanting to build healthy soils. We all know that good soils grow good plants, but without you know, a healthy plant community generally, and you know, when you look at places where there isn't a lot of plants, like a desert or something like that, pretty much soil is just weathered rock particles. So it's rock that's broken down over a long time, and that takes a long time for that to happen. So really, once you bring plants into an environment, and you know, the evolution of soils has happened with plants over billions of years, where, you know, the first plants sort of started to grow, and then they would sort of decompose, and you know, that would start to put some carbon compounds into the soil, and microbes would come and get involved, and the whole process sort of started in combination with plants and soil. The reason why the plants are so important is because they're the ones that are catching the energy that's going to drive and feed all of life. So to get your microbes and your animals functioning well, even us, even our cars, all of that originally came from photosynthesis, from, you know, energy that was caught from sunlight. And so that's really what's going to drive living processes. And what's more, the molecule that is, you know, made during photosynthesis, the carbohydrate molecule, is kind of the building block of all matter as well, which is why we're all, you know, carbon-based organic sort of beings, I guess, is because, you know, carbon molecules were ingested, and then they were sort of, you know, sort of different elements became involved, proteins were made and that sort of thing as well. But basically you have to have those carbon molecules to start building organic matter. So photosynthesis is crucial to all of that. In exchange for the carbon compounds, which plants are then pumping down into their soils, microbes are offering a range of services back to plants. And, you know, a lot of those services are very, you know, they're obviously very beneficial to plants, because it's in the microbes' best interest to look after the plants that are growing, because they are their food source. So much of what the microbes do is actually supporting the plant community. So whether it's acquiring nutrients from, you know, the weathered rock that's around, or whether it's creating, like, you know, sticky substances that cause soil to aggregate, which then allows, you know, air to, you know, move and water to get in, water to be stored. All of those processes pretty much are driven in that combination of plants and microbes. So yeah, I think we could safely say that, you know, the presence of healthy plants and their microbes and animals that are in the communities are what really is a large determinant of what, you know, gives you good soil quality. Without that, soil just would not happen. So it is kind of an egg and a chicken scenario. It goes both ways, but it starts with the plants. So just to kind of emphasize that, there's this is an audit that was done, you know, about a decade ago, of all the living biomass on the planet, and the square on your left is just showing, you know, what basically all of life, the components of all the life on the planet. And as you can see, out of the 550 gigatons of life forms, plants were a full 450 gigatons of that. So they're over 80% of all the living organisms on this planet, living species. So there's a reason for that, and that's because they're a big driver, as we've just talked about. They're the ones that are bringing the energy in, they're starting the building of matter. And then if you look at the next biggest groups, bacteria is up there at 70 gigatons, fungi comes in at 12. So again, we're talking about microbes there, and protists as well. Viruses are sort of part of that as well, and archaea. And then you finally get down to this little 2 gigatons that's left out of the whole 550, which is animals. And that includes insects, fishes, mammals, the whole lot. So we need that much plants to support all of that, to support that. So if we're in the livestock game, growing cows, we really need a lot of plant matter to actually do it effectively. And you know, if we're going to improve our soils, we need a lot of plant matter to be feeding all the microbes that are doing all that process as well. Cool. So how does it work? That picture's just a bit, can I raise that a bit, Kate? Just raise it a tiny bit. So this is just a basic picture that I've done just to try and sort of talk about all the ins and outs of what's going on in here. And I could talk about this picture for ages, but this here down the bottom is just sort of like a microscopic view of a root tip. And I just want to talk about some of the processes that are going on in this whole picture. So we have the plants growing, and they are sending exudates, which is sort of the byproducts from photosynthesis, down into the root system. And I've purposely put 2 different plants here because there's a distinction in what plants will put out. So the exudates that they'll pump out into the soil will be different between one type of plant and another. This is a grass and this is a legume. So they will pump out sort of, you know, different sort of compounds. Some will have more amino acids in, you know, there'll be a range of enzymes, that sort of stuff. But yeah, their compounds will vary, and that will attract different populations of microbes. What's more, the type of compounds they will pump out could vary depending on their needs. So if they need, say, a little bit more phosphorus, they will pump out exudates that attract phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. And then also the exudates that they pump out will change over time. So, you know, early in life it might be quite different to when they're seeding based on, you know, their requirements. So they're pumping out these exudates into the soil, and they're basically leaking out of the roots around them. And as a result, you're getting all these microbes that are coming in to feed. And there's such a range of microbes that hang in the vicinity here. There's obviously a little, you know, bacteria everywhere. There's also mycorrhizal fungi that taps into the root system, and they're going out into the soil and gathering nutrients. The mycorrhizal fungi is a big player because not only are they sort of tapping into the roots and gathering nutrients from the soil, they're also pumping carbohydrates out as well from the roots. So they kind of like extend the root system out. And what's more, because they're so fine, they can get right into all these little sort of crannies in between, you know, fine particles and stuff like that, and into the films of water and all that around particles too. So it just increases the surface area like exponentially, having mycorrhizal fungi in the picture. There's bacteria that the plants even eat these days. So like some of you might have heard of Rhizophagia. I think Kate put a thing on it on the last newsletter. So like some of the bacteria get ingested, they get taken into plant cells and swallowed whole pretty much, and then the plants will then like break down their cell walls and suck the metabolites into the system. So they're getting like complete meals out of these bacteria, complete proteins and all the rest of it. And in the process of spitting out the bacteria, root hairs are formed, which then further accentuates, you know, the amount of surface area that's going on and the access that the plant has to all the things it needs. When all this these plants die, obviously there's going to be litter that ends up on the surface, and then you also might have animals that come along and eat and deposit manure, and you also might have, you know, even dead animals, whatever. You end up with a lot of organic matter that's on the surface, and that also goes through a process of decomposition, and then in that process minerals are released back to the soil and back to the plants basically. And then it keeps on getting digested and digested until it gets to this point where there's really fine microscopic sort of fractions of organic matter left, and these tend to line your particles in your soil, and then they clump together, they stick together, and they have charge on them, so they hold on to nutrients, they stick together, and that starts the process of microaggregation, which is just small crumbs in your soil. And then you get things like mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots and root hairs, which then take these particles and they kind of bind them all together, and that forms your macroaggregates, which is bigger particles of just, you know, clay, silt, sand, or bigger crumbs, should I say. And, you know, they're all bound together. And inside that aggregate is a very contained environment where moisture can be retained. You know, there's all sorts of like, the conditions are right for certain species to live in that. That's actually a habitat. And they can just keep on working along in that contained environment. What's more, as you know, the season might dry out or whatever, you've got these stable sort of crumbs that help prolong, you know, the habitat for life and those processes that are so important over time. The other thing with aggregates is, of course, they're going to be creating air spaces. So, you know, oxygen can get into your soil, which is really important for the microbe life. And also, you know, carbon dioxide can be released, all your gases can be released. But probably most important of all is that water can get into your soil because there's this crumbing structure. And within the aggregates, water can be held onto as well. So there's all these different processes that are going on that are really important, that are contributing to this. And all of it is coming basically either from root exudation or plant matter that's decomposing on the surface. All good with that, folks? Where did I put? Oh, it's over there. It's on the thing.
Sorry, move this. Okay.
That's all right. Thanks, Kate. Cool. So, I mean, in a way, what's happening again is the microbes are not only gathering nutrients for plants, but they're also carrying out a whole range of services that are going to make the growing environment much better for plants. And then that two-way exchange happens where plants are happier, they grow healthier, they're going to pump more sugars down to the soil, they're going to put on more biomass, more animals, etc. And it just sort of, you know, it's a self-supporting or self-perpetuating system. That's just a picture I took of, that was, I think, an oat seed that I sowed, or it was part of a cover crop, and, you know, dug it out just like a week or two later. Probably about 10 days actually after it sort of first emerged, and that was primed. So it was started off. The seed was coated in, you know, like a very good compost extract, which we're going to talk about this afternoon. And the whole idea of that was just to kickstart that whole microbe plant bridge. So it stimulated microbes in the soil, stimulated the plant to start exuding, and that whole process begun. And you can see what's happened is it's really like, because it's putting out all these exudes, there's a lot of microbes that are coming in, and as they're sort of having their party, they're releasing a lot of sticky stuff. The roots themselves are releasing sticky stuff. I mean, sugar is quite sticky in its nature. Mycorrhizal fungi starting to grow, the root hairs, and all of that is grabbing onto the soil and starting this aggregation process. So these are called rhizosheaths, and on those, within, you know, a rhizosheath again is like an aggregate. It's a very contained environment that's protective. It sort of can regulate pH, moisture, the oxidative state of the soil. So all of these things are kind of like, regardless of what the soil's like, if a plant's got a good rhizosheath, it's going to be a lot healthier because it can kind of create its own conditions that are helpful, well, in combination with the microbes that are living with it. So again, it's kind of pumping out the right exudes to get the right microbes into the equation. So this is just a statement by Christine Jones. I'm sure that you've all encountered some stuff from Christine Jones if you've been hanging around the Lower Blackwood Catchment Committee long enough. So she's obviously pioneered a lot of work in what we're going to talk about today. And the reason I put the statement up is because we've talked about how plants are creating soil, but of that, the biggest process by far is root exudation. So in terms of building soil, you can add compost to your soil all you like, but you're not going to build, and you know, it's practically hard. It's practically hard to add compost to acreages of soil. But when you get living plants growing and doing that whole process we've been talking about, and the exudation is what drives it, even though you might maintain a stand of like, say when your plants are finished growing and you've got cover, like dead cover on the surface, and the decomposition process happens, all of that is contributing to the whole thing, but nothing like living plant root exudates. Okay, they're really the thing that's driving out a lot of energy, and I'll just show you why. So if we think of this as, like, this is the energy that plants make available, And this here is that matter that's made available back to the plants for growth. So it could also be services as well, but things like acquiring nutrients, when your animals come and they eat things and their waste products go back to the soil, that's also making nutrients available. And then finally decomposition, which is, you know, what happens when you're making compost or when you're, you know, like things are just litters breaking down on the surface layer. This is the pools of energy that are driving all these processes. There's root exudates, there's living matter, which again, all, you know, consumption can happen, you can come and eat them, but living matter is also putting out the root exudates. And then you've got dead matter, so once your plants are dead and they're lying on the surface, and then the only pathway really is, you know, decomposition. So I've drawn it like this because I want to show the pool of energy that's available, and if you really want to get things happening quickly, you've got to sort of focus on this area here up the top. So what happens when a plant is exuding what it's just made through photosynthesis, those high energy compounds, and they're going straight to the microbes that are then going into the soil and getting nutrients and giving them straight back to the plants to support them to grow more. They can grow more, put out more exudates, they can get more nutrients, and that really is where it's all happening. That's the quickest way to get things happening with living plants. Now, there might come a time where your plants get start to dry out, the rain starts to dry out, or they start to go to seed, and in which case they stop exudating as much. But one way of keeping them in that space is by possibly grazing them at the right time, which you guys know a lot about and you've been talking about. So when you come in and you graze them before they get reproductive, it causes all this exudation again, it causes them to grow back vegetatively, and they keep in this area. At the same time, they're also depositing nutrients that are stimulating more of that as well. The animals are just depositing nutrients. And then finally, at the end of it all, it's middle of summer, everything's dried off and it's just dead matter. There is this process can happen. But you think about it, a plant has gone here, it's putting out a lot of energy. It's going straight from photosynthesis straight to microbes. By the time it's actually living matter, the plant's had to use up energy in growing, so it's already wasted a whole lot of energy, and so the actual energy that's available is less. And by the time a plant gets to be dead, you know, it's grown, it's reproduced, it's put a whole lot of energy into seeds, it's probably lost a whole lot of carbon back to the atmosphere as well as proteins and all that sort of thing. So the amount of energy that's available is much less. So really, the energy that's available from living plants and the root exudates is really the strongest driver. All of these processes are important, and in a way today we're talking about multi-species mixes in cover crops. We're sort of talking about I guess forbs and grasses, things that are very herbaceous and they grow and they exudate an awful lot. If you were talking about trees, a lot of the carbon and, you know, the matter goes into like the trunks and they have a deeper little layer, and these other processes are more part of that. But, you know, when we're talking about sort of pasture species, very much this is the area we're focusing on. That all makes sense? Yep, nothing you haven't heard before? Cool. So, I think we can safely say, yes, root exudation, living plants, those are the big drivers of what's going to make a healthy soil. I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to start a project at the Eco Village where I just got given a blank slate. It was actually kikuyu, which I had to get rid of first, but then I had just basically a patch of soil and happened to sort of inherit the garden around about this time of year. There had been nothing done there, no inputs put in or anything like that. So it was a great spot and it was actually a demo garden was what I had to create. So it was a great spot to do a whole lot of trials and just prove some things. And so what I did is initially, after getting rid of the kike, is just you know, a multi-species mix, make the beds and throw it through the whole garden just to get the soil built and get some biomass happening, grow some mulch for spring. So I didn't even worry about putting any crops in initially. And I did a lot of trials. So this was one where that was the multi-species mix that I used generally over the season. And then I've got these little patches here, which you can sort of see. And this is exactly the same soil and setup, folks. And this was sown at the same time. And these little patches are the species that are in there, but separated out into monocultures, individual. So you can really see, I mean, this is the peas, this is field peas, and these are the peas in here. You can really see the difference in growth. So it's not just about root exudation, it's also actually about this multi-species thing, which we're going to talk a lot about today. I also was lucky enough, well, I also split the beds up, and I did some, like we did soil tests and looked at what, I put like a range of different fertilizers in different beds, and then had some controls where I put nothing in at all, just to see what the difference would be. And not just fertilizer, but biostimulants, all these different treatments. And this is just 2 beds. One of these had fertilizer put in and one didn't. Can you tell me which one was which?
The one on the top was fertilised.
Yeah, okay. And ironically, that's not the one that's fertilised. They, to be honest, I mean, just maybe because of the light, it looks a bit more luscious on the top, but they looked pretty much the same. So when I had things in a mix, it seemed to be that it didn't actually matter about the fertilisers so much. However, if I was growing them as separate single species crops, then very much I would need to focus on the nutrition. So there's something obviously going on here when you start mixing in all these species together, and that's what we've got to talk about next. So when you get a whole lot of different types of plants, each of those, like I said, hosts unique microbe populations. And so when you've got a variety of plants, you're then, calling on a wider pool of different types of microbes. And each of these microbes might be unique. You've got like everything from mycorrhizal fungi to phosphorus or, mineral solubilizing bacteria. You've got reducing organisms. You've got actinomyces. You've got a whole range of different things, and even within that there's a lot of different species that will associate with different plants, and some of them are better at getting nutrients, some of them are better at aggregating. It all depends on the plant and what its needs are. The plants are very different. They're as different as the animal kingdom, really, if not more. They have different metabolisms, so there really are lots of different microbe populations that come when you add a diversity of plants in there. So obviously that's going to mean that the system as a whole has better access to nutrients, resources, water. It's better able to carry out services like aggregation and humus building and all that sort of stuff as well. And then the other thing is that you've got these networks everywhere, so that those resources that have been gathered can be shared much more efficiently. Might just show that video at this point in time, Kate.
Mark,
yep.
Can I just ask?
Yep.
The fertiliser, no fertiliser photo.
Yep.
Is that contradicting your use of biostimulants? As you were saying, with that photo that you're holding up your roots, that you did do biostimulants.
Yeah.
How does that fit into that test that you did?
When I did the patch, I divided it one way with fertilisers and another way with biostimulants as well, like compost extracts and stuff. And I had controls as well where there was nothing at all. So the control also had some with just biostimulants. There was some with just fertiliser. It was quite a grid that I did. It turned out that the biggest factor from the trial was that multi-species was the most effective thing in terms of actually growing biomass. The second thing was probably biostimulants. Right, so you'd look across the rows and you would see where I'd done the compost extracts that there was just slightly better growth and also faster germination. And so those patches got off a little bit quicker than the other ones. But they did actually kind of catch up pretty quickly once they got going. Mind you, I had treated the soil well. So it all depends on the context. If you're starting on a soil that's really dead, your biostimulants are going to have a greater effect than if you're starting in a soil that's already pretty good. A lot of the time, if we're dealing with a soil that's already got organic matter on there and that sort of stuff, there's going to be a lot of microbes already present in the situation, and they will come along. Obviously, Rhizophagia, your legume inoculants are one that can have a big effect when you haven't got those species in your soil, and mycorrhizal fungi. you know, there's sort of mixed sort of debate about how effective it is inoculating with those sort of things, but I've certainly found it to be effective in things like potting mix and stuff like that, where I use mycorrhizal spores and, you know. But when you're adding compost, you might be adding live organisms, but you're also just stimulating the ones that are there. And I think that's the important thing, is that's the stimulation factor where it gets everything going. So yeah, I don't, like, those two photos were both from places that had probably biostimulant put into them. Yep. So Kate, I'm just trying to find where it is. It's just the one, just ignore the other ones and just go. So this video is of, basically it's a very up close look at mycorrhizal fungi, and what you'll see is that around the outside of the mycorrhizal fungi there's a film of water, okay, and it could be water, but it's also probably got sugars in it and all sorts of stuff, and in that there's a whole lot of bacteria that are flying around using this water film as a highway. So mycorrhizal fungi is amazing. I mean, it's so microscopic, it gets into, you know, these little fractions of soil. It's got these water films. And, you know, people say, oh, you know, if you get good mycorrhizal collination, then you're going to get good phosphorus uptake. But probably a lot of it is to do with the bacteria that are living on the fungal highway, which are taking advantage of those sugars that are getting pumped from the plant into the mycorrhizal fungi, and they're sort of getting nutrients and sending them back through. So the fungi is probably the biggest part of the network, but it's doing it in collaboration with all these other organisms. And if you're growing brassicas, for instance, like, you know, rape or canola or whatever, it's not a mycorrhizal species. It doesn't host mycorrhizal fungi. So straight away, you're not going to have that in your soil. You know, you're not going to be promoting that in your soil. So by mixing in some other crop that might be mycorrhizal, you're bringing that into the equation, and then you've got a better network going. And what's more, they're showing that if you grow brassicas in a multi-species mix, they actually do tap into the mycorrhizal network, even though they don't host mycorrhizae themselves. So, yeah, again, just having those different things that attract. Don't know what the volume's like, but it doesn't really matter.
You don't need it?
Nah. So that's the hyphae there. You can actually see all the movement of the sugars and the waters going back and forth, and nutrients as well. And these guys are just, I mean, look at them, they're just hooting around like they're fishes in a sea, really. So yeah, really efficient sort of systems that can move all the goods around. And if that's going out far into the soil and it's getting nutrients from far away, it can bring them back into the plant. And what's more, it can get into all the nooks and crannies as well. So it really, really increases nutrient uptake. Cool, that's probably enough, Kate. Yep. Get the idea. You can just shut that one if you want. It's all right, I can just fast forward. Yep, that's pretty much where we were. All right. So, I'm a horticulturist more than a farmer, but so I did put photos of veggies on here instead. This is actually a guy, there's a book called Roots Demystified, and he spent, between him and another couple of Russian scientists and stuff, they spent ages like doing these cross sections and profiles of soil to see how roots grew. And just wanted to show you, like, these are just some, these are plants that you might get, not the actual vegetables, but you might get them in a multi-species mix, these species or these families. And you can see every one of those is square foot, basically. So you can see just how the roots spread differently through the soil. So if you're just growing a crop of just radish, for instance, you really haven't got much coverage. Whereas if you're mixing radish with something like that, you know, it'll be growing through, and then something like cauliflower, it's really, really spreading out this, you know, dense set of roots. Sweet potatoes going further and wider. So, and all of that is putting out exudes and, you know, rhizosheaths, aggregation, all those same processes that I keep harping on about. This is just one with root depth. So you've got here, false bone set. It's not even a plant I've even heard of. Anyone heard of that plant before? No, it's over in America, I think, or somewhere around. But you can see how deep that's going, down to 17 feet in the soil. It's a perennial plant, so that's one of the reasons. You've also got a carrot there, corn and beans. So, you know, classic cropping, sort of cereals and legumes, you're really not getting that deep. Whereas at least in your pasture situation, you've got the opportunity to bring in these perennial species, and they're going down, and they can get from the depths of the soil nutrients that have washed down lower in the profile and bring them up, and they can also access water. And then if they're connected via the mycorrhizal network to the other plants, they can keep some of these plants going for longer in the season, feed them nutrients if they can't get hold of them, and so start working together. And that, I guess, is why when I showed you that picture of the multi-species mixed together, how the peas just grow so much better when they've got a whole lot of other things with them rather than just peas by themselves. Beetroot, this is just over time. So, you know, early in a crop's life cycle, if you graze it too soon, you're not going to get much value out of it. But as it gets older, it gets a lot more roots down, a lot more deeper. That's just a beet, you know, so it still goes down to 10 foot in the soil if you give it time. One more video I want to show you quickly.
What was the name of that book you mentioned then, Mark? Root something?
Roots Demystified. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, cool. So just maybe don't play it just yet, Kate. So this is an area, again, same garden where I'd done the cover crops and all the trials and stuff like that. And this video I took the following spring. So after the cover crop had been terminated. And really this is just like, that's only had one season of a diverse multi-species mix in there. And I did it, you can see the remnants of it. So there's still some of the pea pods, and you might see a bit of crimson clover still growing around. So basically, in one season, I wanted to show how much aggregation had happened, and because of that aggregation, the capacity for water to get into the soil and also to be held in the soil. So you excuse the amateur footage, but you'll get the picture.
Okay, here we are watering, and I'm just going to water it for a while because the water is just going straight in, and when it finally puddles I'll take it away so you can just see how quickly it's sucking in. So there's still not much of a puddle forming even though I've been watering it for a long period of time. Try again. Just sucking straight in there. Might have to get a bit closer. Alright, we'll go over here so where it's just normal soil. And just do the same thing. And that's the result, folks. Literally less than 2 meters away, and it's just running off, not going in at all. Right.
Cool. So you can see, like, I could just stand there and water it for ages, and it just kept on taking that water in.
That was one season.
That was one cover crop. That was it. I think when I started the garden, it was just kikuyu, and I did weed mat it, and that weed mat killed the kike, and because the kike had been there already, that had also done some of those processes, and I didn't come along and, you know, I just pretty much like sowed the seed into that, so I didn't come along and break up the soil or anything like that, so they already had some aggregation maybe had happened, but yeah, basically it was just one solid season, and I let the
difference between the two spots. They both had kike and they both had weed mat.
Yeah. Oh no, the other spot had, it did. Yeah, that's right. Where I walked to, you mean? Yep. Yeah, I did let the cover crop go quite long, as you could see the pea pods, because I wanted that root, you know, those big root systems to happen, and lots of that. I was less worried about getting nutrients and feeding livestock. I was more about forming soil to start the garden off with. So, yeah.
Did you reduce compaction at all?
I did do some, and I didn't do others. The same thing. And yeah, where I aerated a little bit, it was a bit better. but that was already done before the cover crop was sown. So yeah, I mean, obviously where I went to and walked, it might have been probably some more traffic in that area and all that sort of stuff as well. So, you know, that all plays a part, but the cover crops were definitely a big part of it. And that, yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, when you've got cover crops growing over your winter season, not only are they opening up the soil and making water available, but every molecule is, you know, got a lot of water in it. So if you're getting more life, bringing more life in by having this robust plant community photosynthesizing, making more life available through plant matter, microbe matter, all that sort of stuff, then what's happening is every single molecule is holding a bit of water, and as, you know, the season gets drier and peters out, it just means your bank and your storage of water is a lot bigger. And, you know, the fact that you've got water contained within living cells or within, you know, residue sort of organic particles are kind of like a sponge that hold onto it, just means you're going to get a lot longer out of your season. And I'm pretty thankful for it this season, because like the soak's been filled in where that garden is, and I'm relying on these guys to drop water in a tank to water it just for one last bit before we probably have to shut it all down. And you know, there's sometimes I don't get to water the garden for a week, and we're growing, you know, annual vegetables like tomatoes and corn and beans, and yeah, it's still hanging in there. But yeah, it's probably due to a lot of that sort of initial work that was done with, you know, even while I'm still growing crops now, I'm still cover cropping in between and during cropping, and before and after, interplanting, that sort of stuff as well. So trying to get a lot of diversity in there. Yep.
That cover crop just grew for the whole season? You didn't defoliate it at all and let it grow back? Or?
I did in some situations where I wanted to plant early vegetables. I did a bit of that, and also did things like where you slash it or graze it. I've got guinea pigs in the little garden, and then just trying to emulate, you know, a bigger situation, and then, you know, like sort of start planting in strips, let it grow back, you know. So that what I found is that where I cleared a strip, and if I plant seedlings, provided the crops that are growing next to them are vegetative, like the cover crops, they actually support the establishment of the seedling. If they're not, you know, like they've got a bit of space, they're sort of like the connection starts to happen. However, as soon as the cover crop starts to go reproductive, it starts to take an awful lot away from the situation. And that's a really important point. It's like, you know, as soon as it's going reproductive, things stop exuding so much, and, you know, the whole thing slows down a lot. And also the plants that are going reproductive become very competitive. So they will steal nutrients, steal water, and they'll even probably release substances that stop the plants growing around them, because they need what they need to get to seed. So yeah, I mean, you could definitely do that. The only problem with the coming in and terminating or slashing or grazing is that you knock out some of the species. So your legumes, like your vetch and your field peas, lupins, that sort of stuff, once it's grazed, they don't come back, whereas your cereals do and your clovers do and that. So you've got to make sure you have enough of a mix of stuff that you're not going to just turn it into a monoculture by grazing it, sort of thing.
Yeah, so I guess the context and background of the question is that, you know, practical farming sense on, you know, a grazing property,
yeah,
you're not taking any opportunity really to graze those crops, you know.
Oh no, you definitely are. So
you have to, but in that situation where the water was, you know, penetrating really well,
yep,
had that been, I guess that's my point, had that been defoliated a number of times during the growing season?
Yeah, it would be less, the infiltration would definitely be less, although it just depends on how you manage your grazing, because, you know, like if you come in and you graze it and stop it from going reproductive, it then regrows again, and provided you don't overgraze it or graze it too soon, every time you graze there's a huge amount of exudation that happens, and then the regrowth, you know, if you let it go long enough, it starts the whole process again, and you can kind of, by keeping things vegetative, you prolong your season and your exudation into the soil. So the grazing can work both ways, but you've just got to be really, you know, manage your grazing well, and that's where all of the stuff that, you know, Kate's been putting on and talking about, all these different grazing systems, and it's different for every area because you've got to work with the seasons and the animals and all that sort of stuff, but it's really important to be aware of these are the principles that I'm talking about, and I guess if you can focus on photosynthesis and root exudation as your prime goal for building soil, that's how you manage your grazing. You think of your grazing that way. And
I suppose, Mark, we haven't done much about grazing cover crops per se.
Yep.
And when the when the right timing would be for a multi-species
Yep.
to be grazed, so that you don't take away you don't disadvantage the root growth for your peas,
Yep.
etc. So
Yep.
it's a balancing act, I guess. But
It is.
can you give some sort of guideline as to
Yeah.
when a first graze might occur in a multi-species mix, where you've got?
I mean, if you don't need the feed and you've got your you can have your optimum situation, you would let it go all the way to flower, but not to seed set. That would really do a lot. As soon as it starts to go to seed set, exudation drops out, and so then but this kind of crops are still quite palatable even during flowering. So you can get your stock in there, and there's a huge amount of biomass. Cows have a field day in a cover crop. It also depends on how much you've got, because like if you're grazing and you've got a lot of areas that are down to multi-species mixes, you have to start grazing some paddocks earlier than others, but then you might leave them longer to recover as well. So all of that becomes part of it. It's just keeping an eye on those paddocks and thinking about exudation. And obviously at the end of the season, you do want to let some paddocks go all the way to seed maybe as well, or just all the way through, which naturally happens anyway in spring unless you make hay or something like that.
There's the other thing too, which is probably a bit of context, we might talk a bit later on about it, but if you're putting perennials like cherry and plantain, etc., in your mix, they need an opportunity to come through.
They do.
So you need to take away, I suppose you need to terminate almost the other stuff. The other stuff. So
you do.
It can come through it in a timely enough way.
Yep, absolutely, Kate. So yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want to get it on and graze it when it's, under a foot, but once it gets to a certain height and you want to give those perennials a go, it might be a great time to come in, knock the annual legumes out, knock the cereals back a bit, give those perennials a chance. And the perennials, by their nature, once they're established, they tend to come back really quickly when you graze. So like if you've got something like chicory and you come in and you graze it quite hard, if it's an established chicory plant, that will shoot back first of all and get a real go. So, it all depends, again, on what you're using, what species you've got in your mix, how many perennials are in there. And, we'll talk about it a bit later, but when you're designing a pasture mix, you want to be careful not to have too many of those vigorous annuals growing and overcrowding all your slow establishing perennials as well.